It's always a great pleasure to welcome all of you to another MITA session, but this one is particularly sweet because, as you can see, one of the punishments for being on our programs is that you have to come back. So many of you will recognize immediately the face of our colleague Robert Marshall, and sitting next to him is his wife Traute. I have known them for most of my adult life, and it has been one of the great blessings of my life, not just to have them as friends, but to learn from both of them over the decades. And we're just starting now a sort of series on Bach, and there's lots of ways of doing it, of course. And one of the things with Bach is that there's no traditional place to go to get a kind of the Bach tour. I mean, if you go to Vienna, there'll be 100 tour guides that'll want to show you all the Mozartstätte and all the Beethovenstätte, all these various places. You go on these tours because a place like Vienna or even a place like Paris are full of musical history. But the life of Bach is lived in a part of the world that is not the highest amount of tourist traffic. Would that be a fair statement, Traute, just in general?
It certainly wasn't. It is beginning to be, though.
Absolutely.
And while we were doing the book, the population there said, we are open for tourists and tell everybody how wonderful it is. So we are hoping to contribute to more tourism.
The two of you are a very, very special case. Why don't you just give us a couple of minutes about how this project came about?
The initiative came from the American Bach Society, which is the scholarly society of people interested in Bach in the United States. And they have their own publication series, although for the most part, what they did with their publications was just take items that were published in Europe, usually in Germany, and then redistribute them for the American audience. This time they thought they wanted to have a book of their own. And the head of the publications committee, George Stauffer, asked me if I would be interested in putting together a book on the Bach sites, as he called them, the various towns where Bach was active. There were a number of such books in Germany. Some of them were, in fact, very scholarly, almost too scholarly. And he thought it would be very good to have one that originates in English. And also it would be the maiden voyage of the American Bach Society publishing items of its own. And I thought I would only consider doing it if Traute would do it with me, because she had so much experience actually in cultural writing. And I thought if we had a combination of a cultural historian and someone who studied Bach, we might be able to make a full contextual survey. And what attracted me was that I didn't think of it as being a tour guide as much as kind of a combination of a reference work and a biography of Bach. And we would be able to reconstruct his life by taking a close look of the various places where it unfolded, and seemed to have an intellectual stimulation as well as being something that would be handy for people who wanted to go and visit. And it turned out that this initiative came after the unification of Germany and East Germany, Thuringia, which is the Bach cultural area of Germany. And in fact, altogether, this is the cultural heart of Germany. West Germany, which was the only part that was open to people in the United States and in Western Europe for all the years after the war, was never that intensely cultivating of the arts as was the Thuringian Saxony areas of what became Eastern Germany during the Cold War. But now it was opening up, and with the influx of infusion of funding from the West, they were becoming very conscious of rebuilding their cultural heritage. And they wanted to invest greatly in reconstructing, well, the cultural heart of German history, which included, of course, music history, also literary history. And that was to the great benefit of people interested in Bach, because just about every place Bach ever lived and worked was in this part of Germany. And it was now opening up for the first time. Germany now is going to become a cultural mecca, almost on the level of Italy or France or England. But it was going to become a competitor now for the first time, really, in modern times.
I'm asking Traute if Bob had to twist her arm to get her to kind of collaborate.
Far from it. I thought it was one of the most wonderful projects we could have to work on together. And since I'm a native German, I grew up in West Germany. So East Germany was for me just like the other side of the moon. I barely knew it. And it was very thrilling to really spend time there and acquaint myself. my background is in German literature, and so of course I knew about Weimar and Goethe and Schiller, but it was all book knowledge, and now we would see the real thing. So that was just absolutely thrilling.
Well, maybe now would be a good time for me to actually start sharing the screens, and I'm going to go right here. Exploring the world of J.S. Bach, a traveler's guide. You have actually been very interested in Bach's early biography because very little was known about it. In fact, I remember in even your class that I took many years ago and anything I've had since, you kind of get through those years pretty quickly, don't you? Bach was born, his parents died, and he was shipped off to relatives.
Well, of course, there isn't that much music from his early period, the way there is in the case of Mozart, for example. Bach was not a child prodigy. So people usually begin studying the life of Bach when he begins to compose. But it's really interesting to have some of the background because he was actually shuttling around more as a child than he did later in his life. In that, he is perhaps somewhat comparable to Mozart, although nothing like on the same scale. Before we get too far, and that is, I didn't want to call the book this title. My title for the book was Bach Country, Town by Town. It had an American swagger to it, like Marlborough Country or something. But we had to go with this, I think, a little more prosaic title.
Yes, and I love the basic pun that one would have with Bach Country and Back Country.
Uh-huh. That's right.
So I was very disappointed also. Traute, this looks like a map that has a bad case of the measles.
Yeah, so this is essentially Thuringia, which is considered the heart of Germany. I mean, if you take Germany all, it's almost in the center. And at the time, it consisted of many, many small courts, political entities that were typically divided among the sons when the ruler died. And then they were further divided. And that's why you have this patchwork of little entities, often not even contiguous. And each one had a little capital town and a prince who wanted to live like a prince. So there is a castle, there would be a park, there might be hunting lodges that he would have, and he would have his musical establishment. So the region into so many principalities was actually wonderful for music because you had all these competing court music establishments, incredible numbers, and they all needed musicians, and every principality had its major church with an organist, with cantors. So the intensity of the musical texture was unbelievable. Not at all to be compared with something like France, where everything happens in Paris and very little outside. So here it's all over. In tiny towns, I mean, we have to realize a town like Eisenach, none of them is more than in 5-digit numbers. And there are principalities that have 8,000 people. So those diminutive principalities is a very striking feature of this area. And it made the travel so interesting because you see incredible numbers of palaces, churches, city halls. Each one is a city. They're not villages, even though by population size, they're tiny.
Did this play some role in attracting the Bach family to this region?
Oh my goodness, they were living there for centuries before Bach even appeared on the scene. I think they just were rooted in this area. They didn't actually immigrate into Thuringia. They were native Thuringians, which is interesting though, because Bach himself didn't realize that his family began in Thuringia. He thought that his ancestor, the patriarch, had emigrated from Hungary into Germany to escape the persecution of the early Protestants by the Catholics. But Bach was wrong about that. Actually, the family had begun in Thuringia, and then his patriarch had moved to Hungary and then came back in the middle of the 16th century. So it is a firmly rooted Thuringian dynasty.
Were there any other families as deeply rooted musically as the Bach family, or were they kind of the spring of this kind of music?
I can't think offhand. There must have been other musical families, something like that, because trades and craftsmanship was always family affairs and inherited from generation to generation. But the Bach family was particularly notable throughout. In fact, one of the princes used the word Bach as if it meant a musician. When one of his music masters died, he said, I have to get myself another Bach, by which he meant another musician. But it turned out it was self-evident it was going to be someone from the Bach family. But the word was almost synonymous with musician in Thuringia in the mid to the late 17th century.
Now, for those who are fearful that there's going to be a test on this map, let me put you at ease with the next map, this one. This is a map that Bob and Traute created that simplifies things immensely.
Well, as you can see, they're all cluster except for Lüneburg. And Lüneburg, Bach spent a couple of years there in secondary school before he had his first professional position. But other than that, this cluster of towns is really where his life unfolded. Leipzig is a little on the east, and then to the west, it goes to Eisenach, where he was born. So those are like the brackets.
Helpfully bracketed in pink. Those were the towns where Bach actually lived. He went from Eisenach to Ohrdurf and then way up to Lüneburg to go to high school. And then he came back to Arnstadt to get his first job. And then after 4 years, he moved on to Mühlhausen, where he spent only a year, then moved on to Weimar, where he spent 9 years, and then on to Curtin, where he spent 6 years. And then he finally landed in Leipzig in 1723 at the age of 38 and spent the rest of his life there.
Well, to give us a sense of scale, if I were to walk.
Well, let me say this. When Bach went to Lüneburg for high school, after being in Ohrdurf, which you remember is right lower than Eisenach, that was a distance of over 200 miles. That was 230 miles. And you could do at most maybe 20 miles a day, either walking or taking a coach or hitching a ride on a farm wagon. And it would all take the same amount of time. You did maybe 3 or 4 miles an hour is the best you could do.
And the roads were not spectacularly paved, were they, Traute?
Exactly right.
No, they were notoriously bad. In fact, in Germany, there's like a division. Whatever had been occupied by the Romans in ancient times had fairly good streets, but anything on the other side of that dividing line had bad roads into the 18th century.
I noticed the Elbe River is sort of the right-hand flank of Thuringia.
Yeah.
We all hear about the Rhine and the Danube. The Elbe is a beautiful river, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's the major road there. And of course, it goes all the way north to Hamburg, where there's the major German harbor. So it was a crucial link from as far south as Bohemia and then all through Germany to reach the open sea. And Dresden is on it famously. And every other trading route, I mean, land routes went east-west mostly from Western, Eastern Germany and then even into Russia, but they all had to cross these rivers. So that's why a lot of important cities are along rivers, because you had to have a bridge or some way of crossing, and that often led to towns. So you noticed on these other rivers that are shown here, Leipzig is on a river. They're almost all. Erfurt is also on a river. So these northeast rivers had to be crossed, and often towns started as crossing points.
Supposing, Traute, I'm not a resident, for example, of Weimar. I want to get in there, but I don't get there till 8 o'clock at night. Can I get in?
Now you can. In the old days, you had to pay. If you didn't come during the day hours, the gates were closed, and then you had to pay a fee, and your name would be taken down as a foreigner. They're all in a register, and then they would let you in.
Wow. And they must have been quite fit, because I'm just thinking if you wanted to visit somebody across town, you didn't call an Uber, you walked.
Yeah, but you know what? These cities are so small. Even Leipzig, which was considered a big city, it was encircled by a wall, like they all were. And today, that's a ring of greenery. And you can walk around it in like an hour and a half, all around the town, and you cross the town in 40 minutes max.
So they were all like the Vatican, and they were walking distance throughout the city. You could cross the diameter of any of those cities in less than an hour.
Yeah. So nobody needed a coach. Everything was on foot.
It's a real human scale, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Let's move on then to Bach's birthplace in Eisenach.
We chose to have a goodly number of photos because we felt this town has probably the most places that Bach saw or was involved in that still survive. So this is what's called the Bach House. It's now a museum. And for a long time, it was considered his birthplace. It is not, but it is a building that dates way back into the 16th century. And it was at one point, somebody by the name of Bach lived there. And so that caused the confusion. But it is now a wonderful museum devoted to Bach, and it brings a lot of tourists.
Now, how did you find out, Traute, for example, that this is not where Bach was born? Because the tourist guide writing the travel log thing is not going to bat an eye. It's like, this is where Bach is born.
This was basically chosen because, well, it was old and it was a stately looking house, and people like to think that this was the house of the ancient Bach family. That actually is, we know now where Bach was born, what street he was born on. The house he was born on no longer standing there. It's just a little apartment now, a modern building. But this looked like the ideal romantic notion of where a great composer should have been born and where the family should have lived. Actually goes back to the mid-15th century. And now it's a museum. This is interesting. One of 6 museums. There are 6 Bach museums in Thuringia. 6 museums devoted just to Bach.
Yeah.
But this is one of the most impressive. This one and the one in Leipzig.
It does remind me of the student prince or something looking at it. So, Traute, what do we have here?
So this house is just behind the one you just saw, and it has a plaque because this was where Bach's father, Ambrosius, lived before Bach was born. So it has a relation to the family, but not to Bach himself. You can see the plaque to the left of the door that indicates that it was the house where Bach's father first lived when he moved to Eisenach.
Traute, what is the kind of tradition that ensures that we know, in fact, that that's where Ambrosius Bach lived?
Old town records, he was an employee of the court and of the city.
No, that's it. I mean, municipal records, church records. A lot of those archives are still intact in Thuringia, especially in these smaller towns. So they can pretty much reconstruct fairly well who lived in these houses. But what they don't know, and this sometimes becomes relevant for Bach biography, is when houses were sublet by the owners to other people. And then we don't quite know for sure whether the people we're interested in were in there. But in this case, Ambrosius owned the house, and so his name is documented.
Traute, maybe this is the right moment to bring in then this gentleman.
Okay, there is Ambrosius. And as people point out, he is dressed like a craftsman, not like an educated person with a university degree, but rather music was a crafts. And he was a town piper, which meant not only did he pipe with wind instruments, but he also played the violin. That was, a town piper was really a general musician who was employed by the city as well as the court. And that was Ambrosius.
And he really demonstrates himself here as a man of the people. He doesn't wear a wig. His shirt is open. And he looks like a very accessible, real person. And in the background, when you look through the window, you could actually see the great castle of Eisenach, the Wartburg, that we'll be getting to in a moment.
Just to the right of his face.
But he must have been a formidable enough person that they wanted to have an oil painting of him. It's very unusual.
Why did he get painted?
That's a good question. Apparently, people thought he was notable enough that they wanted to have his likeness.
I mean, it could have been commissioned by himself too. It's
Yeah.
not out of the question.
We don't know.
We just don't know.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
let me get to the next image here.
Okay, so I'm basically tracing Bach's way to school that he did every morning. And he would have walked past this Bach Museum house and down the street and come to the city square. And in the middle of the square is the church, St. George's Church. The patron saint of Eisenach is St. George, so he has a big role to play. And this is the church in which Bach was born. So if you go to the next picture, you would see the inside. By the way, this front is actually new. Bach would not have seen it that way because it's a much older church, Gothic church. And a typical Protestant church, because it has all these balconies on both sides, those were typically added after the Reformation to have people very close to the altar. And if you look at the altar in front of it, just below those 3 steps, is the baptismal font. It's the one over which Bach was baptized. And these colors, by the way, are very recent and supposedly the original colors. In the chancel of the church on the right-hand side, we can't quite see it, would have been a glassed-in area where the ruling duke would attend the service. And that was the only area of the whole church that could be heated. The rest could not be heated.
It's perfect.
But it is very colorful now, and this is all very recent. The first time we went to visit Eisenach in connection with this project, it didn't look like this at all. It was all white and falling apart. And then they did this great renovation job and made what they think are the authentic color schemes, which, as you see, are really very bright and colorful and lively. We were very delighted when we saw it. We put it on the cover of the book because it seemed so dramatic. And at that point, it was really absolutely new. Anyone who hadn't been to Eisenach very recently wouldn't have seen this.
And this church, by the way, also has, behind the altar, you can see those stone panels. Those are actually depictions of the various landgraves of Thuringia, because this was the Wartburg castle above Eisenach, which we'll see later, was the residence of the rulers of Thuringia in the Middle Ages. And a lot of them were buried in this church. Eisenach is not a godforsaken town. It was very central throughout those centuries.
Traute, what fueled the local economy of Eisenach? What was it built on?
I mean, a lot of it was local.
Trade routes. It was on the trade route.
It was on a trade route.
Right?
I mean, there's a lot of wood forest. The Thuringian forest is famous. So even into the 19th and 20th century, there's a lot of woodworking done, toys, Christmas decorations. And then further east in the Saxon part, there is a lot of riches in silver. So those regions are much wealthier, like Dresden and to the east. But this region was never really all that wealthy, but trade.
But there was no homeless problem.
Don't ask us questions we can't answer.
Okay. All right. The town square.
Now we're on the town square, and you see the fountain in the middle. Above it is St. George slaying the dragon. The church would be on our back. To the right is City Hall. And you see at the tower, it has those 3 windows that are now glassed in. You have to imagine were open. And that's where the town pipers would have played from several times a day on their trumpets or whatever else they played on. So Bach's father, that was one of his places of work.
Functions, yes. So he played from that tower, that black tower. And the yellow building right in front of us, that's more recent. That's a palace from after Bach's time.
After Bach's time.
Yeah.
But the building in between is a pharmacy that would have been an apotheke in the Middle Ages, or when it was built, Renaissance, and today still is a pharmacy. Okay, so Bach would have passed these things. On the other side would have been the palace as it was then, but there is almost nothing left.
I love these open squares. Any Italian influence, or was it always done this way in medieval Germany?
And of course, the Marktplatz, that's the German word, means the marketplace, because there weren't really so much stores. People came when market was in action. And so you have to think of this all being covered with little stands, and people would go to shop there. So a market square typically has no trees. It's really wide open because you need it for commerce. So it's like a farmer's market, but everything was a farmer's market. You bought your clothing there, you bought everything, because stores in our modern sense wouldn't be viable in these very small towns.
Got it. Boy, I'm learning a ton already. What
Okay,
about the Latin school?
now he reaches his school. This is the school, in his time was called St. George's School, and it was a former monastery. And in the Reformation, all monasteries became secularized. If the region, the ruler, adopted Protestantism, then the monasteries became his, very lucrative. And the monasteries that had schools typically maintained this tradition and were schools, Latin schools. That is the upper levels from age 10 on, more or less. And this is a large square. I mean, we just see the corner, but this has the entrance. And the interesting thing is that Luther's father, who wanted his son, who was clearly very bright, to be educated, sent his son to Eisenach to attend this school. So Martin Luther was a student of this school.
Exactly 200 years before Bach.
So this is a very proud tradition. And today, this is still the high school of the city of Eisenach, except now they call it Luther Gymnasium, because Luther plays, in a sense, a bigger role than Bach. It is a plaque, and it says he was a student there from 92 to 95. And below is another plaque that says Luther was there. But
so ages 7 to 10, then Bach goes to school here.
Yeah. He learned reading and writing. It typically was taught informally by the parents or by someone they hired. But then the formal schooling for people with ambitions was a Latin school, and you could enter at whatever age you were ready. In fact, schooling was not by age, but by what your facilities were. So Bach typically throughout his school life was the youngest or among the youngest in the class because he was so prodigiously even good in school subjects. And students were simply given an exam when they entered and then placed in the appropriate level of instruction. So there could be kids ranging in age for about 5 years range in the same class because they had the same preparation. It's an interesting concept and I wish we would adopt it maybe.
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, this is the house where Johann Christoph Bach lived, and Bart should fill in who he was.
He was of the parents' generation. He was Bach's first cousin once removed. He was the first cousin of Bach's father, Johann Christoph Bach, who was probably the most gifted musician in the Bach family before Johann Sebastian. Bach himself describes him in a genealogy he put together of the Bach family as the profound composer. And he played his music fairly often, even in his own work in Weimar and in Leipzig. And he was an organist primarily. He was a very difficult, temperamental person. He was a true artist personality. And in many ways, he was the black sheep of the Bach family. He was always getting in trouble with the authorities, in which he set something of a role model for Johann Sebastian in his later dealings with his bosses. And Bach obviously admired him greatly. And Johann Christoph had a lot to do with the renovation of the organ in Eisenach. He made plans for it. Bach watched them renovating the organ, learned a lot about the mechanics of organ building by seeing the renovation carried out in the St. George's Church and putting into effect Johann Christoph's plans. So it was a very important influence on Bach, both as an organist and as a composer, and even as a personality, standing up for what he believed was his priorities and the prerogatives as a musician who knew what he was talking about.
So Bach, in his first 10 years, saw Johann Christoph on a regular basis.
Oh yeah, surely. Every Sunday when he went to church, he would hear Johann Christoph play.
And that's just the plaque on the house, which is actually now a private dwelling.
Right.
This is now, those roofs that you see are actually the roof of the school, of the Luther Gymnasium, of the former St. George's School, and some modern additions. And the wall is the old city wall. Outside the city wall was the cemetery. In the early 20th century, actually, the cemetery was no longer a cemetery and became a park, but they saved some of the funeral monuments. And against the wall, this thing in the center, is a plaque simply saying, this is to the memory of the many family members of the Bach family who were buried here. But of course, in Bach's times, he would know that there were all these graves of his ancestors, of other Bach family members. And there is this poignancy because just opposite the school, just across this wall is the cemetery. And at age 10, Bach would lose his mother first, and then his father remarried, and then his father died, and all within a year. And while Bach was at school, this church, it's a small one, it looks bigger here than it really is, was built as the church of the cemetery. And you see a cemetery, this is in that cemetery, just opposite. And it was being built as Bach attended school and was then the place where he would have attended the funeral service for both of his parents. Just incredibly moving to have all these things so close together, and how he kind of lived seeing this building going up and then attending the funerals.
Do we have any clue at all what happened to Bach's parents?
Cause of death. I never saw anything on that, no.
And what kinds of things would take people to their grave?
Yes.
Plague, among other things.
Yeah, and of course there was really no medicine
And
to
they
speak
both
of.
died at the age of 50, and that seemed to be a very common age to die at. Bach's father died at the age of 50, Bach's mother died at the age of 50, Bach's older brother, with whom he went to live after his parents died, he died also at the age of 50. And when Bach turned 50, you could tell that it registered with him. That's when he started putting together the genealogy of the Bach family and trying to put things in order, began his interest in assembling and coordinating and making a systematic review of his achievements in his life.
This is a question one might put to a psychiatrist, but it was fairly common then for kids between the ages of 10 and 15 years old to lose their parents. Does that mean that since it was so common, the trauma was less?
How would we know?
surmise for us?
It is very clear that the large families, many siblings, which spanned a fair range of ages, were definitely expected to then take care of their younger siblings. If the parents died, you would not be going to an orphanage. You would go to your siblings' families. And that was the standard and very frequent event. And happened in Bach's case too.
And before he lost his parents, he lost some of his siblings because he was the youngest of 8 children. Only 3 of them survived. And so he was surrounded by death. That was such a common neighbor in people's lives back then. And of course, that played a great role in his religious outlook and altogether in the theology of Lutheranism, that this world is a trail of tears and happiness will come in the later world. Many of Bach's cantata texts deal very explicitly with that notion. And you could tell that death was a neighbor, was almost a member of the family.
To our most dramatic image.
So this is the Wartburg, and parts of it go back to the 12th century. Well, what's left now. And as I said, it played a huge role in the Middle Ages. It again played a big role in the 19th century for political purposes. And of course, because of Wagner and the Sängerkrieg, there's a huge concert venue in the Wartburg now, which was painted in the 19th century with scenes from Tannhäuser. So you have all these layers of history. There's also a very venerated saint, Saint Elizabeth, who was a Landgravin, and most German school kids would know about her. And then Luther, when he was excommunicated in effect and had to fear for his life because of his stand against at the Eye of Worms, he fled to this Wartburg because the Landgrave, the local ruler, protected him, and he lived there for a good while, and that's where he translated the New Testament into German. So for German Protestant religion, this is again a venerated place because Luther lived there, and supposedly in some frustration, when the devil appeared to him, he threw his inkwell at him, and they still have this inkblot supposedly. The Wartburg for German history is just like layers and layers and layers of meaning.
Well, now we're actually going to move way north, right, Bob?
Oh, yes. What did I say? It was 230 miles north. In the meantime, though, there were 5 years interim after Bach's parents died in 1695, when Bach was 10, until 1700, when he lived with his older brother, whose name was also Johann Christoph. There were 8 Johann Christoph Bachs in the Bach family, who were all musicians. And anyway, the older brother, Johann Christoph Bach, lived with him until it became too expensive because Johann Christoph, his older brother, kept having more children in his family. And at one point, Bach had to leave, and that happened by around 1700, and he managed to get himself a stipend to go way north into Lower Saxony to Lüneburg, which also had a great musical tradition and a commercial distinction too. It was part of the Hansa League, the Hanseatic League.
And the school he attended there was, there were 2 schools that were attached to this church, St. Michael's Church. One was for noblemen and one was for general audience, and he was in the latter, but they shared the same teachers and facilities. So he got an excellent education there.
And it had a magnificent music library, really, with hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts and prints from the 17th and even the 16th century. And it included music by Heinrich Schütz, Bach's greatest predecessor in Germany. And we don't have any documentary evidence that Bach actually knew the music of Schütz, but it's very likely because it was right there in the library of the Michaeliskirche, and it seems very likely that Bach got to know the music not only of Schütz, but maybe Monteverdi and Carissimi, because they were represented in the Lüneburg Music Library. And he was getting active now as a musician. He was a singer in the chorus until his voice changed. He describes that very colorfully in his autobiography, where he says that he was able to sing in octaves for a while when his voice changed from soprano to wherever it landed, probably as a bass. And then he lost his beautiful voice, and he had to make sure he became competent on the violin and on the organ for his future career.
I'm looking at the scale of the church, the little teeny people that are on the floor down there. Yeah. I mean, this is like an enormously tall church. Who built these churches, actually?
This one was attached to a monastery, again, St. Michael's. But we chose this print because even though the church still stands, all the equipment, all the things that you see were removed as part of the 19th century, when purity was at some point desired. So what you see on the left is an organ that no longer exists. And so this was what Bach would have seen, with all this gilded and decorative stuff. Now it is rather austere.
But it must have taken 20 or 30 years or 50 years to build this church.
Oh, sure, yeah, this was
People had all the time. Yeah, the devotion to build large churches is amazing. And whoever has been in France knows all those cathedrals. But it's similar here in Germany, except at somewhat smaller scale. But the city of Lüneburg has 5 major big churches. I mean, big, really big, admitting, easily 1,000 people. And you always wonder, isn't that kind of megalomania? But that was to the honor of God.
Well, I just checked in the book, and it said this was built between 1376 and 1418. And it's an example of the brick Gothic church style, which is very common in northern Germany.
So 42 years seems fast. Absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
So what have we got here?
Oh, this is where Georg Böhm used to live. Georg Böhm is one of the great organ composers in the generation before Bach, probably the most important one next to Buxtehude. And he was an organist at the other church in Lüneburg, the Johanneskirche. And it's almost a certainty that Bach lived with him for a while when he was a student in Lüneburg, because he signs one of his manuscripts that he's writing it from the home of Georg Böhm, who was almost certainly his teacher too. So Bach obviously took organ and composition lessons from Böhm for at least a while during those 2 years that he was in Lüneburg.
This is a typical width of a street, right?
Yeah, that's the street,
yeah.
right next to the church, close to the church, the St. John's Church, where Böhm played.
Yeah, because everything had to be contained by a wall, the streets were all very narrow, and the only really big open space was the Marktplatz, the market square.
Traute, who are the walls protecting all of these people in these various towns from?
Well, all kinds of enemies, all these little states, often they went to war against each other, but also security against thievery and roving brigands and whatever else. And also control. That is, you knew who came in and out. People who lived outside the city walls had to fear for their lives often when there were major wars. And the major east-west routes, that's where the soldiers would also come. So if you were a big town with a lot of streets converging, you were exposed to the military. And so there too, the walls would help. Okay, this is Georg Böhm's church. We don't see the church itself because of the angle, but you can see from the tower, it was an impressive church, much bigger than the Michaeliskirche, really enormous, with 5 aisles, just spectacular. And Lüneburg is one of those very few German cities that was not bombed at all and is just gorgeous. And you can see all those Gothic Renaissance buildings all over. I mean, the whole city is like an outdoor museum.
So Traute, during the Second World War, was the bombing kind of random in this region, or were there particular places that they were going after?
You don't waste your bombs. Leipzig was a major goal because it's one of the biggest railway hubs.
Yeah.
Frankfurt and Leipzig are the big hubs in Germany of all the railway lines. And also where there were big industries. So if you had war industries, I mean, everybody knew where they were. Those cities were damaged tremendously. If it was just historic buildings, why bother? Now, anyway, so this is just lucky that there was nothing really worth bombing. By the way, this town was particularly rich because it had salt deposits in the ground, which were gradually depleted. And when they were depleted, then some of the town sunk. But so one of the churches collapsed because there was nothing to hold it. But it was very wealthy because of the salt. And, in the old days, salt was the thing that conserved things like fish. So they were exporting salt to Hamburg and abroad. And so this was very wealthy, unlike Eisenach.
So that's where the phrase, he was the salt of the earth, comes from.
Very possibly. Oh, another thing, before we leave Lüneburg, let me just say one of its advantages for Bach was that it was close to Hamburg. And he would go regularly to Hamburg and hear the opera, the Hamburg Opera, and also go to hear the fantastic church organs. And that's where he heard the music of Reinken, for example. was very stimulating for him. So he used Lüneburg for those 2 years as a stepping off place to go do some cultural excursions of his own.
All right, but now he's got to earn a living.
Yeah.
Okay. And he walks back from Lüneburg into home country and very soon gets a job in Arnstadt. And this church, this is the back of the church that we see, is now called the Bachkirche. In the old days, it was called the Neue Kirche because it was the newest one that they had rebuilt after the predecessor had burned down. And we'll see the interior very soon. This organ at the very top, what you see is what Bach actually had in front of him when he played the organ, except it was not yet gilded and painted. So the organ was in place, the building was fairly recent, but they hadn't had the money to paint the building inside and gild it. So it was just raw wood, everything.
Was this a good starting job?
It wasn't bad. No, he got paid at least as much as his predecessor, even though he was only 18 years old. He apparently was made a very good impression on them. He came to examine the organ that had just been built. And in his auditioning of the organ, they offered him the job, even though he never applied for an official organ position. And even though he was a resident organist, they gave the job to young Sebastian.
And also, to his advantage, there were already a lot of Bachs in Arnstadt. There was a tradition of Bachs in Arnstadt. So he came with a good label.
For our first piece, Bob, I've picked a discussion of this piece by this wonderful organist. It just takes a couple of minutes.
Okay.
And let's go ahead and listen to this. This is an early organ piece of Bach's that actually occupied only a page, right, Bob? It wasn't a terribly long piece, but here's a wonderful discussion of it with subtitles.
Bach heeft een zestal van deze heel vreemde koraalbewerkingen gecomponeerd. Het zijn hele korte stukjes van 1 blad. Het zijn eigenlijk gewoon koraalzettingen. Met tussen elke koraalzin een hele sliert van noten en toonladders op en neer. De harmonisatie zelf gaat soms heel ver, van verminderde septiemakkoorden tot vreemde wendingen en dissonanten die niet oplossen of naar een ander akkoord oplossen. Je merkt toch heel duidelijk een hele jonge Bach van misschien 15, 16 jaar dat experimenteert met akkoorden en je merkt daar een jonge puber Bach in dat zich eens goed uitleeft op het orgel met deze stukken. Is het een experiment van Bach geweest om te experimenteren met die harmonisaties? Of is het een voorbeeld geweest voor leerlingen? Of heeft hij deze gecomponeerd na zijn bezoek aan boekstudie in Lübeck? Er is weinig geweten over deze vreemde stukjes eigenlijk. Ik heb het ooit 1 keer geprobeerd om dit te gebruiken als begeleiding. Dat was mijn koor en een dirigent. Maar eigenlijk de dirigent zelf kon haast niet volgen. En het was zo moeilijk om het in te zetten, zelfs met dirigent. Dus ik kan niet geloven dat dit gebruikt is als gemeentezangbegeleiding. Zeker niet. Uiteindelijk gaat het toch heel ver. Als je van akkoorden gaat van E groot naar C klein, is toch wel enorm verre wendingen en dan altijd maar verminderde septiemakkoorden. Dus het gaat toch vrij ver inderdaad. Ja, dat je bijna denkt van, is het nu Reger of is het toch nog gewoon Bach?
I thought that gave a wonderful introduction to.
Excellent, yes. And that's where Bach got in trouble with the authorities for the first time, was as a result of playing pieces like that during the church service, where they said that he was always mixing in strange tones, confusing the congregation as to what the melody was. And then he put in these little interludes between the lines, between the phrases, that they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And he was officially reprimanded in the consistory building by the elders of the church and the members of the government. We have a picture of that building where Bach was taken down on the carpet.
Before we get there, this is where he also composed one of his early cantatas, Bob. Tell us, what is the role of the cantata in the Lutheran religion?
It's part of the sermon, so to speak. It was a kind of an enhancement of the sermon in the view of Martin Luther. He thought the two ways to broadcast the word of God to the believer was through the sermon on the one hand and music on the other, because music can penetrate the soul better than anything else. And so he said himself, music is next to theology in importance for any Christian. And church music, whether it was a cantata or earlier forms of vocal singing, concerted music, were part of the core of the service. And it was kind of like an elaboration of the sermon, so maybe picking up on elements of the sermon and setting them to music.
By now, Bach had heard a good number of cantatas. He knew the game, basically.
Every Sunday, he would have heard a cantata or a sacred concerto, more likely, a Geistliches Konzert, which were the earlier forms, the prototypes for what became the larger church cantata of the Bach type. But he heard them throughout Eisenach and in Ohrdurf even, and Lüneburg. He heard church services and he sang in them once he got to Lüneburg.
So is it fair to say that he came into his maturity at just the time when the cantata was assuming its highest peak of importance?
Well, he gave it a major push. In these early cantatas, they aren't yet into what we think of as the typical Bach type of church cantata. They don't yet have recitatives and the capo arias, and they are much more close to the 17th century model of motets, or with little strophic song types of numbers interspersed, and mostly based almost entirely on biblical texts or chorale texts. This is different from what would happen in Bach's later years when he moves on to Weimar and Leipzig.
Let's listen to this wonderful chorus from this early cantata, Christlagen Todesbanden.
And it's an Easter cantata, it's important to know.
Okay. An awesome piece for someone at any age, but he's in his early 20s, right, Bob?
Yes, he's around 22 years old. This is something he probably wrote at the very end of his time in Arnstadt when he was about to leave. And this might have been his audition piece for the Mühlhausen job, because he took the audition, we know, on Easter Sunday in 1707. And this is an Easter cantata, and it's definitely very early. So this is probably the earliest surviving church cantata that Bach wrote at all. And it is quite remarkable. It's a complete setting of all the strophes of the Lutheran chorale. This is Martin Luther's own text. And as you can tell, it's 17th century style. It's like a motet. There are no separate instrumental parts, only a continuo, and with highly imitative texture, and based on the lines of the chorale melody, which is sung as a cantus firmus in one of the voices. And it's very graphic too. At the end, it talks about one debt ate up another, the Tod verschlungen sich, or something like that. And he has a very close stretto there. So you have the idea of these voices toppling over each other. So it's quite pictorial too, as well as being very exciting. It has a lot of hubbub in it, capturing the sense of agitated battle between life and death, which is what the text is talking about. I mean, life is the victor.
But also devilishly difficult to sing.
Oh yeah, I got to practice.
Now,
Yeah, but it's definitely challenging, and who knows how well it went. My suspicion is that Bach heard very poor performances of his music almost all the time because it was so difficult, and he had almost no time ever to practice or to rehearse.
the chorus that we saw, this nice mixed male-female chorus and the size of it and so forth, probably were not typical of Bach's time.
Well, certainly the women's voices were not typical. He had no women at all in any of his choruses. In Thuringia, it was always boys' choirs. The size of the chorus is a matter of debate. Early on, it's very likely that he only had one or two voices on a part. Later in Leipzig, when it becomes a larger church and he has instruments involved, and he even tells us how many people he wants to sing it. But the chorus, by our standards, was always very small and intimate.
I love this.
Okay, so this is the Arnstadt Castle. It is a model because the castle itself fell into disrepair, was used as a quarry, and the only thing surviving is this tower that you see on the left. But this was the ruler's residence, and Bach, we know that he came from the castle one night on his way home, and so we assume that he played his violin for the court chapel, for the court Kapelle.
For secular occasions, right, where they had dance music or banquet music, Bach would play for them. He'd also get all dressed up too in a nice suit with a sword.
Wow,
and you
a sword.
can see also that there was a moat around it, which is very typical. So these were started in the times when it was needed fortification, but in Bach's time, the moat simply was still there. So you usually have a bridge going into the castle.
I see the parked car down at the left side of the photo. The scale of this, you can't walk inside this, can you?
Oh, no.
No.
This is not even man high. I mean, it's really small. I took close-up photo.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful picture.
Oh, and there's the consistory building, and the castle tower is in the back. And it was in one of these buildings under this colonnade that Bach had to report and account for himself. They had so many issues with him. I mentioned one already, that he would play the chorales and harmonize them in a way that the congregation couldn't follow it. And then one day he had gotten into an altercation with one of the students. And actually, as he was coming home from the castle and crossed the town square, he was accosted by one of his students, and they called each other names and they drew swords. And Bach was called into the town council again to talk about what happened and whether he should be reprimanded. Then the following year, he was called back again because he was absent without leave. When he was given a 4-week leave of absence to go to Lübeck to hear Buxtehude, which was a 15-day walk away, he took 2 weeks to get there, another 2 weeks to come back, and he had only 4 weeks leave of absence altogether. So he stayed for 16 weeks. And then when he got back, he had to account for himself again before the consistory. And finally, shortly after that, he was called back again because they said he was caught having a strange lady up in the choir loft with him. And what was that all about?
He kept his job, though?
He started looking.
Okay.
Oh, this is nice. In that tower that we saw before is this little room, looks like a prison cell. And this is where the watchman used to live, who was also a musician. In fact, one of Bach's ancestors, the first Bach who ever had a job in Arnstadt, was named Caspar Bach. And this is the room where he probably lived. And you can still visit it, as you see. We were able to go in there, in the tower, the accommodations he had.
And one has to realize that, of course, the town piper really was also the alarm system. So he had to be up there and look out. And if there was a fire, there were signals that he would give. Yeah. Or if there were armies coming, it was a dual policing and musical job, in a sense.
That's awesome.
But in those days, yes.
Yeah.
This is my favorite likeness of Bach, not everybody's.
That's a wonderful likeness of Bach. That's right. This was put up in 1985. It stands in the Arnstadt town square, as you see. And it's supposed to be the 18-year-old Bach dreaming about the voyage he was going to take to Lübeck to hear the great Buxtehude. So he's facing north to where Lübeck was, dreaming about Buxtehude, apparently. It's very controversial. Some people don't think it's altogether decent. And we didn't put this one into our book, by the way.
And that's the location where that altercation took place, too.
Yeah, because the courtroom notes say that it took place at the stone bench in the town square. And we think that this statue pedestal is where the stone bench used to be, where Bach had his altercation with a young bassoon player named Bach.
Those bassoon players. Here's a more becoming image.
This is the image we put in our book because we're very prudish, Traute and I. And he's facing the town hall.
And if you imagine immediately to the right is his church, which is one side of the town square.
The square itself goes back to the Middle Ages.
Oh, absolutely.
Without question.
Certainly Renaissance would have been there. And this is a small town near Arnstadt by the name of Dornheim. And this is the church in which Bach got married to his very distant cousin,
second cousin,
Maria Barbara, who he met in Arnstadt. She lived in Arnstadt. She was already an orphan, lived with other family there. They obviously fell in love, and so they got married there. He came back for the marriage ceremony after he had gotten his job in Mühlhausen. And this church is even now very in demand for weddings.
Can I just ask you before we go on, Traute, was she presumably the woman that was in the choir loft with him?
Possibly.
There's been a lot of debate about that. It used to be considered, yeah, there was no question that the young lady he took up to the choir loft was his future wife, Maria Barbara, also his cousin. But she's described in the documents as a strange woman. And Maria Barbara Bach would not have been a strange woman to the Arnstadt people because she lived in the house of the mayor of Arnstadt. She was a tenant in the house of the mayor. She was well known. So this has cast some shadow on who that woman was. Anyway, it's not necessary that there was hanky-panky going on, and it seems that he was giving her an organ lesson.
I recognize somebody in the picture.
That's Johann Sebastian Bach. This is now in Mühlhausen, and this is the room where Bach signed the contract for his job at Mühlhausen, which was a good step up, although he only stayed there for 1 year.
So this was like a chancel room, and this wooden door that you see on the right-hand side, that's the big closet for all the documents. And it is not open to the public,
Exactly.
but we had contacted people in Mühlhausen, and they were so gracious and let us in there, and I couldn't help taking a photo.
People were so happy to help us. And of course, they wanted to attract American visitors to Thuringia. So the mayor of Mühlhausen actually took us here. And in other towns too, we had a lot of contact with local people who also knew a lot about local history, more than you find in any music history book.
And the interesting thing about Mühlhausen is it was actually a Reichsstadt, which meant it was an imperial and free city, again, with huge walls and many, many towers and churches, quite wealthy. Its archives, dating from the 12th century, are still extant. So it's the archive building. You see the cases in which the documents were kept. It's just a huge blessing to history to have a city that goes back that far and has complete records. So this was just a small room with the town administration, but the archive itself is a separate building. But again, a historic building. And you can see these little wall paintings around the doors. The same with the archive. It is decorated. It was just incredible to have so much preserved, including the way the archive had its system of, like the Dewey system, you know, you need to know where to find things. And they had an elaborate system with Greek letters and numbers and this and that, and you can see it all.
It's still preserved that way, yeah.
That's Bach's church in Mühlhausen.
Very impressive.
And very sturdy.
It's octagonal towers.
And he probably lived just to the right of this in the house of the then mayor. And he just crossed the street and he was in his church.
What can we say, aus der Tiefen rufe ich Herr zu dir?
Well, it's a wonderful cantata. And again, the early form, before they have recitatives and arias, this time it's a completely biblical cantata. Christlag and Todesbanden was totally setting of a chorale. This is a complete setting of Psalm 130, From the Depths I Cry Out to Thee. And it is Bach's only complete psalm setting of any cantata. And it has some gorgeous choruses, a very poignant opening movement. And it moves from depths of despair to happiness and blessedness.
Well, let's maybe hear a little bit of the opening of this.
This is the short instrumental introduction, which a lot of these early cantatas do. Yeah, basically a duet for oboe and violin, a discrete accompaniment with strings. And you hear a dialogue style of 17th century. Lord, hear my voice.
Lass deine Ohren merken auf die Stimme meines Flehens.
Now it becomes a fugue.
Höre meine Stimme.
Lass deine Ohren merken auf die Stimme meines Flehens.
Höre meine Stimme.
Lass deine Ohren merken auf die
Lass
Stimme
deine Ohren
meines
merken
Flehens,
auf die Stimme meines
Flehens.
Auf die Stimme meines Flehens, auf die Stimme meines Flehens.
Lass deine Ohren merken auf die Stimme meines Flehens.
Auf die Stimme meines Flehens.
Lass deine Ohren merken auf die Stimme meines Flehens. Auf die Stimme meines
I hate to stop it there, but we probably need to move on. But what a gorgeous, gorgeous piece.
And it's very intimate. You saw the orchestra consisted of one oboe, one violin, and two violas. That was it, and a continuo. And they are doing it appropriately, I think, this time with a chorus of only one on a part. This might have been written to commemorate the disastrous fire that had happened in Mühlhausen the year before, that devastated most of the city.
God is My King is a very different kind of cantata.
Right, that's the most elaborate cantata Bach had written up. It was for the inauguration of the new town council. And here, instead of having an intimate little chamber ensemble, Bach had 5 separate choruses, actually. Instrumental choruses, woodwinds, trumpets, voices, strings, and obligato organ and bells even. He was very proud of the bells they had at the church. So they even have an indication that bells should be ringing, not pitches, but just a ringing bell. And that's
Awesome.
a very sturdy chordal work in many respects, almost Handelian, but very early in Bach's time.
Let's hear it.
Bach here intentionally, explicitly divides the chorus into soloist and full chorus. So he generally had more than one at a time. Very often, as here, these early cantatas are cross-sectionalized, small sections rather than continuous as they are.
I see they're doing social distancing. They didn't show us the orchestra, but it was a very, very impressive ensemble.
Yeah, well, I could tell you what it had. It had
Recorders.
3 trumpets and timpani as the first chorus, 2 recorders and cello were the second chorus. Oboes and bassoons were a third chorus. The strings were a fourth chorus, and the voices were a fifth chorus. So it was a very elaborate, ambitious piece, well beyond what Bach had done earlier in the Christlagen, Todesbanden, and the Austertiefen.
From the photos, I think that this is the interior of the Marienkirche in Mühlhausen, which is now used as a concert hall exclusively. In fact, Mühlhausen has had 5 huge churches, and nowadays one is a library, one is a museum, one is a concert hall, and 2 are still churches. There is just an abundance of church buildings.
Well, that would have been where the original performance took place of that cantata, would have been in the Marienkirche, just as we just heard it. Yeah.
What about this statue?
It was built not too long ago, and it's really called Bach at the Threshold of Immortality. And you're supposed to see the young 20-year-old about to take his place on the pedestal as an immortal with his earliest compositions here in Mühlhausen, works like the cantata we just heard and Austertiefen, and even Christlagen Todesbanden, which may have been written in Arnstadt, but was written for Mühlhausen on that Easter Sunday. So his first real masterpieces were written without question in Mühlhausen. And here you see the young, I think a charming picture of the young Bach about to take his place in Parnassus. The job in Arnstadt gave him almost no opportunity to compose church music, which is what he really wanted to do. And the Mühlhausen job looked more promising. It was a bigger city, he got a big raise in pay, and he took it. But he didn't stay long, because after 1 year, he said, this isn't adequate for me. The musical forces aren't good enough. I think I can do better. And he handed in his resignation. The same mayor who had hired him by the name of Bach was very enthusiastic about him. But then when Bach said he wanted to leave, Bach spoke up and said, there's no holding him back. That's almost an immortal word in the biography of Bach. There's no holding him back. The favorite son of Mühlhausen is not Johann Sebastian Bach. It's J.A. Roebling, John August Roebling, who is the builder of the Brooklyn Bridge. Obviously, he emigrated at one point and wound up in the US, was the chief architect of the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's now a town in Pennsylvania, Saxonville, Pennsylvania, which is the sister city of Mühlhausen. And they have annual meetings there where the people from Saxonville come to Mühlhausen to celebrate their heritage. And that's a statue they have of Roebling, and I thought it would be good to
Presumably holding
add some color to it.
And he's holding,
he's
the,
holding
plans for the bridge. The local high school is named the Roebling Schule. I mean, he's a big deal. And his birthplace is shown, and on and on. Let's
try to get done with Weimar before we call it a day today. He stayed here for a while, right? And this was a step up also?
Yeah. Anyway, he thought he would have more opportunities to write cantatas here, which turned out to be not quite the case. At first, he had a job as an organist, and he spent his first 6 years there just as the court organist, playing in this remarkable chapel, which, as you see, is very narrow and very high, and way up on the top. It's called the Himmelsburg, the castle of heaven, because way up on the top is where the musicians were and the organ was. And that's where Bach used to perform for the Sunday services. And eventually he did get promoted to concertmaster, where he, for the first time, began to write cantatas on a regular basis. These were in his last few years there.
Can you just set this extraordinary piece up, which seems like it must be the product of somebody much older and much more mature?
Yeah,
Yep.
well, this might have been inspired when Bach had gone off to hear Buxtehude, who also wrote a Passacaglia. And Bach then was going to do this himself. We know it's an early piece because it's in one of the earliest manuscripts. It is an extraordinary piece of architecture. First of all, he takes the typical Passacaglia, which is a basso ostinato theme, and makes it twice as long as it's ever been before. The original one was da 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 dum bum ba da 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 dum bum, and Bach then added a whole second part to it to make it into 8 measures long. And he then makes this elaborate architectural set of variations. There are 20 variations, but it also seems to form a larger hierarchical structure with middle sections and flanking symmetrical side sections, but also building to a climax. So it is just extraordinary in its expressive power, in its virtuosity, and its structure. This is so much larger than anybody else's, and more coherent than just a string of variations as most basso ostinato pieces used to be. This one is held together as a coherent entity, as he also does in the violin chaconne.
And might he have played this at the end of the service? When would he have played it?
That is a really good question. I don't know if this would be part of the service at all. It could have been part of a separate recital. We don't know. It could have been during the processional or the recessional at the end of the service or the beginning of the service, or for a separate organ recital. We know that that was what was happening in Lübeck when Bach visited Buxtehude there. He heard organ recitals, and it's very possible, although there's no documentation for it, that he introduced something like that on his own when he was in Weimar.
And Bob, say just a word about the 16-foot stop we're going to hear on the low C that comes at the end of the first statement of the Passacaglia theme.
It's very resonant, very big.
Yes.
And it's the lowest note on the organ, of course, so it really works. You're going to play the whole thing?
And now comes your extra bars.
Yes. Which are nice and chromatic and expressive.
And get ready for the low C.
Very quarterly. That is in the second variation already, but it sounds like a continuation of the first one. Already in larger terms, not simply in these 8 measure segments. Maximizes the dissonance, suspensions.
And the tension of the suspensions.
Yeah. No, the rhythm has to break out. Now it begins to break out. Now he can use 8 notes into motion of the rhythm. Now we are at 16.
So the rhythm just,
Accelerate, yeah.
yeah.
So now he has a dum da da dum pattern. Now he adds wider intervals in that da-da-dum pattern.
Yes.
Now he finally
So straight 16ths now. Did anyone in these original congregations have any idea the quality of what they were listening to?
Hard to imagine. But Bach always liked to say, it's for God alone the glory. Okay. He keeps this ta 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 ta, but he's thickening it. Instead of playing the single notes, they're sometimes playing in parallel thirds or in contrary motion at the same time. So it's just more going on in those 16th notes. Oh, carefully calibrated.
You have to get to Wagner to hear this dissonance level again.
Thank you so much for saying that. I like to think of Bach as being not only a progressive, but as being a visionary. And he was leaping over decades and generations sometimes in his harmonic imagination.
Okay, we have just to hear a teeny bit of this extraordinary cantata. I always love this Weinenklagen, Sorgensagen. Let's hear just a bit of this.
This is one of the first ones he wrote when he became the concertmaster and now was commissioned to write at least one cantata every 4 weeks. You might recognize this melody even if you haven't ever heard this cantata before. You might recognize it. By the way, it's a basso ostinato. It's a continuo. Bass is constantly repeated every 4 measures. It plays exactly the same notes. It's the chromatic bass. Bum, 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 beep, bum, 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 bum. Over and over again. The famous lamento bass from the 17th century. And I don't know if people have recognized this Weinenklagen chorus. It is exactly the music Bach used 30 years later in the B minor Mass for the Crucifixus. Interesting, the Passacaglia we just listened to was an ostinato bass, and this cantata is also an ostinato bass. So you love this variation form. Quite the line, chromatic bass. The anguish of sorrow. Tone painting. Bach knew he had something special here. That's why he used it 30 years later when he wrote the credo of the B minor Mass at the very end of his life. He used exactly this music. I think we forget how expressive Bach was by intent. He wasn't just this mastermind of contrapuntal complexity. It always was serving an expressive purpose. I think that's very important to keep in mind about Bach. It's never
He's the first. Is it fair to say, Bob, that
excuse me?
Is it fair to say that Bach is the first composer that forces you to use all of your intellect and all of your heart when you're listening at the same time?
I think that's right. Yeah, that's a very astute point.
It engages every part of us. Okay, yeah. 30 more seconds and then we're out of here. Try to take us through these slides real quickly so we can finish up Weimar.
Okay, Weimar has 3 castles. The main one in which this chapel was that we saw earlier, which is, by the way, a painting because the castle was completely destroyed in the 18th century. And then this one was called the Yellow Castle, which one of the junior members of the ducal family inhabited. And this young man was a student of Bach's.
That's right. And he died as a teenager. And actually, he was very important in Bach's development. He was himself a composer. He was Prince Johann Ernst. He went to Holland and came back with a cache of Italian concertos by Vivaldi and others. And this is what introduced Bach to the Baroque Italian concerto, the Vivaldian concerto. And without that, Bach's career would have taken a totally different development.
Okay, and this tower is the only thing that's left of the castle in which Bach lived, this tower and this portal building. It was important that we have these 2 pieces because, number one, the tower still has the bells that Bach heard, but this Bastille building was one of 4 such buildings around the whole castle, the only surviving one. And it had the prison cells for not criminals, but for people who had to be detained for whatever reasons. So
we know that Bach was put on arrest for 4 weeks when he wanted to leave and take another job. He wasn't deferential enough in requesting his release. And so the Duke thought that he was insubordinate and locked him away for 4 weeks in a detention cell in this very building. And there were 4 identical rooms around the castle. So it would have looked like this, even if this was not exactly the one he was in. He spent his time doing things like designing the well-tempered clavier.
This is one of the saddest things. This wall is what's left of what was the house in which Bach lived. There was more left after the war, but they tore it down. And the thing behind it is now the parking lot for the adjacent, also very historic hotel. And there's a very active group in Weimar who is trying to get this property and do something about Bach. Right now, there's a plaque, you can see it just above the horses, that says here was where Bach's 2 musician sons were born, Philipp Emanuel and Friedemann. It was an important place for Bach, and the town is so hung up on all the other luminaries, Goethe, Schiller, Nietzsche, the Bauhaus, Hummel, Liszt, you name it. So Bach gets short shrift, unfortunately.
To sort of round things out, listen to this completely different mood.
Completely different, yeah. This is Bach becoming very exuberant and flashy. A toccata is kind of almost like an improvisation where you show off your virtuosity. What Bach does in this toccata is he almost begins to shape it like an Italian concerto. After the opening flourishes and passages and the incredible organ pedal solo, it becomes a strict ritornello concerto with episodes that are something of a theme. So he's beginning to rein in some of his flamboyance of his earliest period. Isolated low pedal C's.
That one right back here, this little sucker right there, that was fabulous. Here comes another one.
Almost up to me. That's to set up this.
Get your feet working.
Yeah.
And now feet cannot go this fast.
notice it all left, right, left, right, left, right. Now comes the Italian ritornello.
Let's just hear a little bit of that and then we're out of here.
Okay. That's the episode.
That's the little idea that keeps returning, right?
Yeah. So he's very slyly introducing some Italian formal elements into this rambunctious, rhapsodic North German rhapsody style.
I would just love to say that this has been a wonderful tour to start with. We're going to have at least 2 more sessions. Bob and Traute, you up for it?
I guess so, yeah. Bach keeps us alive.